Yes. Uh, so this is the third day of this conference for Hany Babu, for the release of Hany Babu. And Geetha is today's speaker, the first speaker. Geetha is a feminist historian, translator, and publisher from Chennai. She writes in English and Tamil on caste, gender, education, and labor. Her published work includes Undoing Impunity, Speech After Sexual Violence, Another History of the Children's Picture Book from Soviet Lithuania to India, and another co-authored book Towards the Non-Brahmin Millennium from Ayodhyadas to Periyar. This is a widely read and prescribed book. And she is currently working on the life and thought of Dr. Ambedkar, and her book, Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar and the Question of Socialism in India, is to be released after this year. And Geetha is widely known, and she is a kind of well-respected public intellectual, taken positions on several issues and part of several solidarity movements. And I request Geetha to make a presentation.
Thank you very much, Satya, and thanks for having me speak on this occasion. As I've been listening to various speakers these last 2 days, I have had very mixed emotions, a sense of hope as well as deep sadness. The celebration of Hany Babu's scholarship, his sense of teacherly vocation, his consistent foregrounding of matters of justice and equality in all that he did and said, these are incredibly moving and signal what he stands for and what indeed all of us stand for in a sense. And it's surely not accidental that those that are incarcerated along with him are also people who have tried to anchor their worldviews in ways that have to do with language on the one hand, whether they sing or they write or they file petitions in court. After Uday Kumar's lecture yesterday, the petition is also a form of political expression that has a long history, as we know. And then there are others who constantly work with the affidavits of the working poor. So in a sense, incarceration has obviously something to do with the way words continue to render the ruling establishment anxious. In that sense, I think there is hope that words indeed are what are absolutely necessary for us to work with, in addition to all the other realms that we work in. But at the same time, the material fact of incarceration and the pain this must cause to all those that are incarcerated and to their loved ones does cause a measure of dismay each time you think about what it means to be in prison. And reading recent prisoners' memoirs, Kobat Gandhi's writings, Arun Falero's writings, you also see what that means. And especially for those that are anxiously waiting outside, that silence and that lack of everyday communication must be unbearable. So keeping that in mind, to sort of inquire into matters to do with politics and language becomes as much a question of existential import as it is of scholarly and political importance. So what I wish to do today is to share with you some brief reflections on something that I hope to write in detail about someday, the relationship between language and truth as the Tamil self-respecters understood it, and which they approached in diverse ways at different moments in their history. Very briefly, the Tamil self-respect movement was started in 1925 by Periyar, and it sort of became a very diffuse, large social movement which was home to diverse ways of looking at social justice. It was contentious. It was not fixed in terms of its political alliances. It remained a very open forum for debate and action. So, amongst the many things that the Tamil self-respecters addressed was language, and I want to speak of their ways of engaging with the language question. And for those of you who know Tamil Nadu, you know that it's best known for, in a wider political commonsensical sense, for its resolute opposition to Hindi as the national language, to being declared the lingua franca of the nation. His opposition to Hindi has a very long history, and if some Tamil scholarship is to be accepted, it would appear to be constitutive of Tamil itself, its opposition to Sanskrit, and then over a period of time to Sanskrit Hindi. But whether one accepts that scholarship or not, in recent history, it's an equally long history. It goes back to the early years of the 20th century when non-Brahmin Tamils and Telugus in the old Madras presidency urged forth the claims of Tamil vis-a-vis Sanskrit and insisted that it be granted parity in university education. Subsequently, with the advent of Gandhi into political life, they were made familiar with his views on language and found his urging forth of the claims of Hindustani as a national language equally problematic, and engaged with him critically on this score for several years. In spite of the fact that the Dakshin Bharat Hindi Prachar Sabha here was established in Chennai and won a number of adherents to its purpose, especially Tamil Brahmins and a small smattering of non-Brahmins. Nevertheless, a large body of non-Brahmins and Dalits continued to oppose the idea that Hindustani could be a shared language for the whole of the subcontinent. And right from the early 20th century, the language question was seen and understood in tandem with the ongoing debate, which, let's say, began in the late 19th century and acquired a certain heft in the early 20th century. And this is a debate about the civilizational worth of Aryan versus Dravidian civilizations. Which is native to the subcontinent, which was an imposition, are they completely distinct, or did they share common traits, or did one learn from the other, which preceded what, and so on. These were debates that were argued out in the emergent discipline of history, but also in the public sphere. So you had the antiquarian and the publicist equally invested in the question of history and culture, and the question of language emerged as salient in the context of these debates. And the view of language in this context was interesting because language was viewed, of course, in terms of the kind of debates around philology and that were current at that time. But it was also viewed as an expression, as a of culture in a very straightforward, transparent sense. So Sanskrit was to be opposed by this reckoning because the meanings espoused in that language through the medium of the Vedas, Itihasas, and Puranas were seen as detrimental to values that Tamil espoused, and which it was argued was all that a Varnadharmic society was not. So Dravidian civilization was understood as supporting an egalitarian, non-hierarchical social order, where the Brahmin priest did not hold sway over linguistic or cultural life. So this understanding existed as common sense. It was argued out in scholarly journals. It was highly contested, but it nevertheless gathered momentum in the popular sphere of communication as well. So that by the late 1920s and early 1930s, there was a resolute sense of Tamil Dravidian culture and civilization as capable of constituting a nation on their own. And when, after the 1935 Act, a Congress ministry was established in Madras presidency after those elections, the government of C. Rajagopalachari made the learning of Hindi compulsory until class 8. And this set off a very, very long-term agitation in the old Madras presidency, and which lasted for nearly 3 years, comprising people from almost all walks of life, including some Tamil Brahmins, which was rare at that time, that Tamil Brahmins would join horse with non-Brahmins. But what was interesting was that these agitations, which began in 1937, also formed a very crucial political rite of passage as far as modern Tamil political history was concerned. For these years saw the morphing of a radical agenda of social justice and anti-Brahmanism into a fulsome political Dravidianism. And what do I mean by that? That language becomes an affective badge of culture and civilizational difference in a very sharp, acute political sort of way. And Tamil, the use of Tamil in public life, in education, becomes in itself a badge of secularity. So, to be united as Tamil speakers and Tamil users and Tamil writers was to be united as a body, as a community that was constitutively opposed to the cultures that were embodied in Sanskrit-Hindi. And this fact of unity then became a mark of secularity. The Tamils, as such, whatever communities or caste they belonged to, were always already secular in that their language did not allow for a inhabitation of meanings that had to do with Varna Dharma or with Brahmanical scripture. And in this, Tamil speaking Christians and Tamil speaking Muslims were at one with the Tamil speaking Hindus. And such an understanding cut across castes as well. And as many Dalits were invested in the language question, as were non-Brahmins from different communities. And this is a complex historical political inheritance for Dalit politics even today, which is why you have someone like Tol Tirumavalavan of the Dalit Panthers of the Vidudalai Sirithaigal, also anchoring his politics of anti-caste radicalism within a broad discourse of Tamil identity and Tamil history, even though he constantly pushes that history and culture to take a reflexive look at itself. Um, After 1937, it did not matter that those who espoused the claims of Tamil vis-a-vis Sanskrit Hindi did not only comprise those who were invested in social justice, but also a range of others, including Orthodox Shaivites, Tamil literary enthusiasts, Tamil teachers, some of whom were congressmen and women. What mattered was that Tamil language and Tamil literature became the modalities through which one could express one's always already secularity. And that has been an important development as far as Tamil politics is concerned. And Tamil literature, especially the poetry of the Sangam age and the nomic wisdom that is contained in the Tirukkural, became central to the making of the secular identity. And the secularity of Tamil was both affective as well as cerebral. As far as its affective dimensions were concerned, it had recourse to, no surprise here, gendered expressions. As far as its cerebral aspects of were concerned, it assumed an analytical, critical tone that was directed against two major points of discord, what came to be termed as Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan, and also the caste order. While gendered lingualism made for a putative Tamil unity and shared, and I must say, predominantly male subjectivity, critical lingualism allowed for the politics of language to be embedded within a discourse of social justice. The language question assumed greater acuity in the immediate post-independence period with the reimposition of Hindi as a compulsory language of learning in the mid-1940s. And there was another round of agitations until the order was withdrawn. And the agitations resumed in 1965 at the time when it was thought that English would cease being the official language of India. And these turned out to be of great significance because the whole question of whether English may continue to be the official language for such a period of time, or should English shall be the language of official communication, these were matters that were discussed through that period. And the whole question of may versus shall became a matter of great political importance in the Tamil Nadu context in the 1960s, which was resonant with the slogan, English ever, Hindi never. So subsequently, as we know, the three-language formula was offered as a sort of compromise, but it was deemed unworkable, and Tamil Nadu has since settled for what we now call the two-language formula, where children that are in state schools learn Tamil and the English language and do not have to learn a third language. Though schools that are under the Central Board of Secondary Education and within the ICSE scheme and the ISE scheme continue to teach a third language. The anti-Hindi agitations, this long history of anti-Hindi agitations, has become a sort of index for defining Tamil exceptionalism on the one hand, and for the sort of federalist claims that the state of Tamil Nadu has continued to make in the post-independence period, which are not, of course, only restricted to matters of language or education, but it is precisely matters to do with language that give it a certain kind of affective power and heft. In that sense, the anti-Hindi position has emerged as a veritable political performative, and language continues to be marked as a badge of difference. And it is in the name of this difference that Tamil ideologues of whatever persuasion, including from the BJP, define their long-standing commitment to social justice. As I said, it's on this basis that the claims for federalism are also advanced. So, given this sort of admittedly potted history of the anti-Hindi agitations and their wider social and cultural significance and political importance, what I want to do is something slightly different. Uh, in the context of this history and against its widely known details, I want to present a more complicated picture of how Tamils that were critical of Sanskrit Hindi did language. And I want to do this so that we might better grasp the twinning of the language and the social justice questions. How did each define itself in terms of the other? And in the rest of my talk, I will do this by taking you through three instances um, over a period of time that unfolded within the language debates and debates to do with culture and nationalism. And the three instances are: one, the distinctive claims of Tamil on history, which were shaped by a slew of developments, starting from the 17th century, including Bible translation efforts and the debates that accompanied these. An early interest in marking Tamil as essentially different that was taken up by F.W. Ellis, of whom Thomas Trotman has written in great detail, and which gathered a kind of energy with the publication of Robert Caldwell's Comparative Grammar of the Dravidian Languages. And it was on the basis of these developments within scholarship and within official debates to do with language, administration, and culture that the counterposing of Tamil to Sanskrit Hindi unfolded. And I want to examine the nature of this relationship of Tamil to Sanskrit Hindi by bringing in a third language, which I shall do in a brief while. The second thing that I wish to address has to do with a reflective examination of the language question that was coeval with the counterposing of Tamil to Sanskrit Hindi. And this had to do with the modernist fascination for reason, science, and secularity, which was initially advanced from the late 1870s by two remarkable organizations which were headquartered in Chennai, in Madras. One was the Hindu Free Thought Union, and the other was the Madras Secular Society. And they ran these two magazines called The Thinker and Tattva Vivesini. And much of what they did in the realm of language was taken up and extended and expanded in extremely exciting ways by the self-respecters. The third thing that I wish to reflect on is the actual doing of language, which asserted its difference but refused celebratory lingualism, and which instead sought to repopulate the content of Tamil, so to speak, through a range of means: new coinages, translations, re-renderings, critique of existing literature. This was, of course, not restricted to the Tamil self-respecters. In fact, it has a longer history, which goes back to the early 19th century. But the Tamil self-respecters brought to this endeavor a vivacity and critical energy that hold some interesting lessons for us as we contemplate the future of languages and the relationship of language to education, politics, and truth. So let me take up each of these instances and work through them somewhat briefly. So the counterposition of Tamil to Sanskrit Hindi exists as a staple of intellectual common sense in the Tamil-speaking and writing words of today, but particularly so in the early 20th century. But there was a very significant inflection of this position, and this had to do with the ways in which Pandit Ayotidas, who converted to Buddhism in the 1890s, engaged with questions to do with caste, language, Brahmanism, and Buddhism. Ayotidas was very concerned with the question of identity and the anchoring of identity in language, religion, and culture. He was concerned with the term paraya, which, as we all know, carries with it stigmatic implications. And he tried to rework the meaning of the term in ever so many ways. One, by constituting the Parayas as the oldest and most original community of Tamils, Purva Tamilar or Adi Tamilar, as Buddhists who had forgotten that they are indeed Buddhists, as representatives of a civilization that was set upon what he called Aryan Milechas, whose arcane and inconsistent lore and what he calls really useless knowledge overwrote all that the Tamil Buddhists had created by way of material production, craft work, literature, and the arts. So you have a sort of overlaying of Tamil expressions with meanings and associations which have nothing to do, as far as Ayotidas was concerned, with its original Buddhist Tamil core. And Tamil for him was one of the two languages that he argued were the vehicle for the expression of the Dhamma, the other being Pali. In one instance, he claims that Pali was the oral language of the Indian subcontinent from which both Sanskrit and Tamil were derived. In another instance, he speaks of the Buddha co-creating Sanskrit and Tamil to convey the import of his teachings along with Pali. So, and his relationship with Pali was very interesting and curious because in his magisterial work, Adi Vedam, which is a sort of Buddha Charita, he quotes liberally from the Pali and translates things from the Tripitaka into Tamil. But you also see that he tries to cross-read Pali references with references to various Buddhist ideas and world views as these exist in Tamil Buddhist texts like the Manimehalai, Veera Sohiyam, and so on. And add to this the fact that he had set up, along with Lakshmi Narasu, the Sakya Bauddha Sangam in Madras, and that there was a very active community of Buddhists across southern India, including in places such as Hyderabad and Bangalore and many other parts of Karnataka, where these ideas of language circulated. So what you then have is this very curious way of looking at the whole question of civilization and culture, which accepted the fact of Aryan invasion, viewed the Aryans as barbarians and as imposters, but which refused to therefore think of the Tamil language only in terms of counter opposition to Sanskrit, but instead viewed both Sanskrit and Tamil as existing in a filial relationship to Pali, with Pali being granted pride of place. And if you read his Adi Vedam, you see how different languages are referenced in the course of that amazing text. And Pali, of course, but Tamil, but also Sanskrit Buddhist texts. And I'm not sure how Ayotidas read these because not all of them were translated into English at that time. You also see references to the Bible, to the Holy Quran, to the Torah, because as far as Ayotidas was concerned, Buddhism was an old religion from which all religions derived their important philosophical and metaphysical ideas. In any case, what's interesting is the manner in which he defined the relationship between language, ethics, and civilization. So the Buddha's creed was inseparable from the Tamil language. The Dhamma was inseparable from its expressions. Both were in fact co-creations. Secondly, he felt that in order to handle these source languages of Buddhism, it was not enough to just indulge in translation in a learned, within quotes, scholarly sense, but one would have to inhabit these languages in the spirit of the Dhamma. In other words, one would have to be a practicing Buddhist to actually grasp the import of these, of what the Dhamma was all about. So, in an interesting sense, language becomes a habitation because language is always already Dhamma in the way Ayodhyadas understands it. And in his work with caste and in his anti-Brahmanical writings, what you then see is the line of difference he draws between the core of things, what he calls ulmei, and what he calls the exterior. And this exterior is not simply about form and content or about the trappings of an idea and the idea itself, but that there is a natural core of Dhammic meaning which has been overlaid by subsequent linguistic incrustation. So, this is a very interesting manner in which the relationship between Tamil, Sanskrit, Hindi, Tamil, and English was sort of unsettled and reworked, and in what was clearly for Ayodhita as a matter for continual discussion and critical debate. So that is something that I want to sort of put out there. Now, the second thing, the Aryan Dravidian conundrum, of course, did not exhaust all inquiry to do with language, because, as I said, the question of language was also sort of taken up in terms of how must one sort of deal with the content of one's linguistic inheritance in this day of science and rationality. And this is something that the Hindu Free Thought Union and Madras Secular Society took very seriously. And in their Tamil journal, Tattva Vivesani, a lot of time was spent on trying to render Tamil adequate to the purpose of scientific communication and to fashion it as a tool of rational critical inquiry that will serve both the free thinker and the atheist, and which will allow for a sort of immanent critique to emerge within the Tamil language itself. Now, there's a lot to be said here for which I don't think I'll have the time, but I want to sort of uh, use that as a springboard, this interest in rendering the Tamil language open to critical scientific thought and inquiry, not just in terms of deconstructing content, but in terms of reworking the language itself. And this is something that the self-respecters sort of took up in a very different and in a more popular and public sense. And I just want to sort of go through some of their efforts in this context, which are quite fascinating. And I just want to sort of start with something as simple as the question of the self. So, as far as the self was concerned, for Periyar at any rate, that self had to do with the name that announced it. So, one of the things that the Tamil self respecters did was to question the sorts of question the sort of names that people were given at the moment of birth. They were named after, say, family elders, or they were named after places of holy pilgrimage or of gods and goddesses. And this seemed a matter of concern to the Tamil self-respecters, who in their turn sought to give names to newborn children, as they were sometimes asked to do, which were drawn from an entirely different context. So that's when Periyar was asked to name children, he would come up with names like Russia, London, Revolution, all kinds of names. And I think this was very interesting because when asked why was he doing that, he would say that to be hailed in terms of a particular name also meant that one was being placed associatively within a certain cultural universe. So one was to be hailed through another set of names, say London or Russia or Gorky or Stalin or any of these other names. That name brought with it a very different set of associations and would make for a different kind of reflection about the self and the world. So this was something that he argued on the matter of naming. So starting from something like that, and then going on to everyday rites and rituals and the manner in which these were understood and interpreted by scripture. And not only did the self-respecters lampoon all these quite savagely and taking apart words, taking apart the meanings of well-entrenched customs and so on, but they also published in their weeklies uh, anti-clerical literature from the West, ranging from Boccaccio's Decameron to Jean Messlier's Life of Christ. So you had a way in which they tried to sort of induce a rewriting of religious scripture by opening it up to a sort of deconstructive moment. And as one of the more erudite self-respecters of that time, as Ramanathan remarked, what we need to do with our Puranas and Itihasas, he argued, was to desacralize them. And here he drew upon the long history of textual criticism that had been applied to Greek and Latin texts, and said that this is what we need to do with our Itihasas and Puranas. So the manner in which then literature and the study of language was opened up to the modern critical moment was quite fascinating. And when it came to Tamil Shaivism, the self-respecters were sort of on more slippery ground, because while they wanted to sort of critique the lore of the Shaivites, they were also very aware of the fact that Tamil Shaivism claimed for itself an autochthonous sort of presence. And its adherents argued that it had very little to do with Shaivism in the rest of the subcontinent. And so, what you then have is a kind of writing that is familiar with the metaphysics of Shaivism, but which then turns that metaphysics to the purpose that the self-respecters wish to advance, to the cause of self-respect, anti-Brahmanism, anti-caste equality, and so on. So you have someone like Swami Kaivalyam, who was extremely learned in Saiva Siddhanta doctrine and a polemicist, writing page after page of critical metaphysics in Periyar's Kudiyarisu. On the one hand, he would subject commonplaces to critique. On the other hand, he would sort of draw on the terminology of Shaivite metaphysics to open up debates within that literature on normative values such as equality, fraternity, justice, and so on. So this was also something that was quite fascinating at that time. Then you had someone like Singaravelu, one of the founders of the Communist Party of India, writing long articles in the vein of those that wrote on popular science. Um, um, then you had antiquarians as well as publicists urging the claims of history versus mythology. This is widespread. It's not simply the self-respecters who did it. But what the self-respecters did was, in this regard, that was specific to them, was that they urged forth the claims of political biography vis-a-vis hagiography. And this is something that you see people like Annadurai doing well into the 50s. But I think what is particularly fascinating about their work is what I call a hermeneutics of radical suspicion, which they applied to all things Brahmanical. And Periyar was at his best here, and I think his classic essay on the meaning of the sacred thread is a very important instance of this sort of writing. And this hermeneutics of suspicion, of radical suspicion, was applied also to what the self-respecters considered the religion of our times, which is modern nationalism. So nationalism as a form of fervent religion was subjected to critique from the late 1920s, whether it was Gandhi and his ashrams, the Dandi March, the manner in which the Ramayana was encoded into discourses of nationalism. So through the 20s, 30s, and 40s, you see a critique that anticipated the late 1940s critique of Hindu Hindi Hindustan. So within the domain of Tamil linguistic and textual expressions, you had therefore a play of reason and criticality. And I think what held that in place was not simply that these were matters that could be subjected to critical rational examination, but also an understanding that knowledge as such is always already partial. And Periyar would talk about this at great length, that no knowledge can be taken to be finite. And in fact, the manner in which he expressed this on almost all his public meetings was to end them by saying that if you think that I have made a rational, coherent argument, examine it at leisure and then accept it. And he would also say that I do believe that 20, 30, 40 years from now, when I'm gone, there's someone who's going to be up on a stage saying that that fool Ramasamy said something which is not tenable anymore. So that sort of self-reflexive reasoning was built into these arguments. And in that sense, the self-respecters sought to unsettle lexical certainties, and they foregrounded associative meanings so that one can turn an unsparing critical eye to these, not only to the obviously obscurantist or hegemonic modes of assertion that one associates with the making of consensus around belief and custom and so on. So, by bringing this rational scientific lens to the content of Tamil literary and everyday expressions, the self-respecters uh, complicated the question of Tamil's relationship to itself. So this brings me to the last part of what I wish to say. Given this history of approaching language in terms of a very large cosmological, spiritual history, as Ayoti Das did, and the manner in which the self-respecters brought a reflexive, critical edge to their reasoning on matters to do with Tamil. How did they do language? This is quite interesting. At one level, of course, they were completely critical of and dismissive of whatever was found in Sanskrit. They were very welcoming of what was available in English because they saw English as a carrier of world historical thought. It enabled them to access fraternal worlds elsewhere, whether it was Kemal Ataturk's Turkey or Amir Amanullah's Afghanistan or the Soviet Union and so on. It also rendered open the world of radical literature to them, not simply the world of liberal thought as an earlier generation of thinkers knew it, not just Rousseau and Mill, but also Marx and Lenin and Trotsky. So all of this was important to them, and English was the means through which this indeed had been made possible. So the relationship to English was one that Hani Babu would have recognized and valued as something that holds within itself the capacity to forge a new kind of sociality, not in not just in terms of it being the conqueror's tongue, but it having emerged in the Indian context as a world historical language. So that's their attitude to English. But with regard to Tamil, what was very interesting was they had a two-pronged approach. One is, as I have pointed out, they were critical of how Tamil could still remain the seat of obscurantism and of religious law. Um, but on the other hand, they also took to defending the claims of Tamil when it was challenged by Sanskrit-Hindi enthusiasts. But in their actual doing of Tamil, they did something else. And I just want to quickly run through a sort of index of what they did. One is, of course, again, to start with the question of self. What is the self to be anchored in? The Tamil self was not to be anchored in Swaraj. Periyar sort of argued that what is one's birthright in linguistic lexical terms? It's not Swaraj. It cannot be Swaraj. For before one could actually aspire to or access Swaraj, one needed to experience the sense of self-respect, Suya Maryade. So self-respect became the ground for self-cultivation and equality and the making of what Ambedkar would call the association in life. And therefore, this self that was sort of charged with self-respect is not simply going to experience the world through blood kinship or the family, and instead social kinship was important in the wider sense of the term, and this was sort of marked by the self-respecters urging everyone to address each other as comrades. So it was not the left that introduced the word comrade into the Tamil language, Torah, but it was the self-respecters that did so. A third thing was to sort of look at the vocabulary of caste and do something critical about it. And here, two terms were of importance, the term Shudra and the term Paraya. And the term Shudra was mapped on to the textual meaning that was accorded to it and which circulated in the popular realm as well. This is Shudras as Dasiputras, as of flawed birth, as those that were children of miscegenated marriages between Dasi of the Dasi Dravidian women and Aryan militias. And here there was a sliding of meaning between Dasi and Vesi. Vesi means the Tamil word for Vaishya. And how the Shudras had come to wear this identity completely unaware of what it signified. So there was a sort of attempt to consistently interrogate the term Shudra. And in fact, the term paraya, even though its stigmatic meaning was accepted and viewed as problematic, it was seen as not as downgrading as the term Shudra, because as Periyar once wrote, the term paraya does not indicate flawed birth so much as separation and abjection, but it also makes it very clear that being placed outside the caste system, the so-called untouchables are the only ones who are of human birth, because everyone else, and here he references the Purusha Sukta, are born from this godhead. So natural birth was a provenance of only the Dalits. So therefore to him, the term Paraya, while problematic, held within itself the possibilities of recovery and liberation, whereas no such thing was possible with the term Shudra. And when he was confronted with the fact of Shudra communities trying to remake their identities by calling themselves Vanya Kulashatriyas or Bhuvaishyas or Devendra Kulavelalas, he pointed out that an affirmation of one's Varna status granted credence to the Varna system as a whole, and worse, confirmed the Brahmin in his position as the superior of the four Varnas. So one cannot therefore get away from the fact of Shudrahood, was his argument. And in this context, very interestingly, given the fact that a number of so-called Shudra castes were also working communities, he sort of tried to place the whole question of caste-based labor adjacent to arguments about class, and distinguished what he called a jati torilali, or a caste worker, from Kuli Torilali, who's a wage worker. And he said the two are not the same, because a caste worker, what he has given to himself is caste consciousness. So he constantly seeks to leverage himself into a superior position within the caste order. And he is not open to remaking this consciousness as proletarian consciousness. Whereas the wage worker, who is perhaps aware of him being a proletarian, is not aware of the fact that proletarian consciousness in itself cannot rid him of caste consciousness. So he tried to sort of work with these two terms in interesting ways, just as he did with the term samadharma, which he felt was more capacious than the term poduvudamai, which is a Tamil word for socialism, saying that the one had to do with the sharing and equal distribution of resources, whereas Samadharma had to do with rights and with the one Dhamma that binds us all as equal human beings. So the whole discourse of caste and class was also complicated. And in this context, religion was brought in a very interesting sense, because if temples are the repositories of God and Brahmanical control, then the Brahmin becomes the mediator of what Periyar considered the maker of, the conveyor of spiritual surplus. By keeping the Shudras and the Dalits in willful ignorance, the Brahmins exploited their, uh, uh, their lack of knowledge, and thereby garnered for themselves spiritual surplus, which was then transferred on to the Godhead. So, according to S. Guruswami, one of the most fascinating thinkers of the self-respect movement, God was not simply God, but he was a stone capitalist. He was a Kal Mudalali. So very, very interesting. And but I think the most fascinating word coinages took place not just in the realm of caste and class, but realm of gender, starting with conversations to do with love. For example, the Tamil word for romantic love, kadal, was reinterpreted so that it did not simply connote sentimentality and affective worth, but also had to do with respect, with trying to forge partnerships across castes and religions, and so on. And in this
Geetha,
context, yeah, I have
please
5 more
conclude.
minutes. Yeah, I'm going to conclude. And from here, what you then have is that desire becomes a natural emotion, as opposed to the lack of choice within caste marriages. Caste marriages themselves become problematized by the foregrounding of chastity as an undesirable norm. And Periyar sort of has an entire set of terms that he uses to criticize chastity. Marriage becomes not a matter of sacrality, but a question of contract. And within the self respect lexicon, there are at least a dozen terms that were used for marriage. And the whole obsession with women's sexuality and its regulation and control is seen adjacent to the kind of fervent, unthinking nationalism espoused by the nationalists and the fervent, unthinking linguistic affect expressed by linguistic nationalists. So, in a very interesting way, the world of gender was sort of sought to be disaggregated. Motherhood was seen as a burden. The word that Periyar uses is pillai perum tollai, the scourge of childbearing. And sexual choice is seen as relative to time and place and history. So, in these extremely fascinating ways, the self-respecters did language by opening up the meanings of words, by coining new words, by scrambling existing words. And of course, in each of these instances, they match what they did with words, with particular acts of protest, with particular claims they made on the law and the state and so on. So, what I wish to sort of point out by way of a conclusion is that these three ways of thinking about language and doing language, the claims made on behalf of Pali, the manner in which science and rationality were brought to induce a measure of reflexivity within those that produced texts in the Tamil language, and the radical sort of unsettling of lexical meaning in contemporary Tamil debates, all of these made for a very fascinating critical public pedagogy, a kind of Socratic labor that was undertaken over decades, and which was then overlaid with the spectacle of the mass meeting linked to affective oratory, which became the hallmark of Dravidian nationalism. So it seems to me that when we think of the relationship between language, identity, and rights, the sort of place granted to anti Hindi agitations and Tamil assertion in the context of Tamil politics has to be read alongside these other ways of doing language, of being in language, of inhabiting language. Though this manner of thinking about language is not often seen as adjacent to the more popular and well-known forms of Tamil linguistic and cultural assertion. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, Geetha, for a very interesting presentation. I'm sure like a lot of questions, but I think we are really running late. So let's say 15 minutes from now, and I will request all the participants to type in their questions and Geetha can answer.
I just put a question into the chat box. Geetha,
Yeah.
could you read? Can you read it? And I hope
Yes, I can, I think. Two questions. Wondering what the self-respecters' relationship to the diagnostic situation that obtains within Tamil and between regional and other socio-lectal language variation. Two, what was their perspective on the long and rich tradition of grammatical traditions, etc., the Tolgapiam and the grammatical traditions of the non-Tamils. The diglossic situation, I think, was not explicitly addressed by the self-respecters. In their own doing of Tamil, they tried to sort of create what might be called a common shared spoken register, which sort of drew from everyday speech rather than from the more literary traditions of Tamil prose, which one identifies with medieval commentaries, but they did not explicitly address diglossia. Um, um, when it comes to the grammatical traditions, it's interesting that they did not engage with it, except, of course, scholars within the self-respect movement counterposed the Tolgapiam to Panini's grammar, and there's always this debate about which preceded what, and they were part of those debates. But Ayodhya Das had some very interesting things to say about grammar. He, for instance, at the time that there was this big proposal to create a dictionary of the Tamil language, um, um, sort of wrote this long essay on the importance of the makers of the dictionary having to heed the Tamil nigandus, the lexicons that had been created over a period of time, largely by Shramana scholars, Jain and Buddhist scholars, because a nigandu was not simply a word list, which is not simply something that sort of referenced meaning, but which also came with a certain cosmology. And he felt that it was important to engage with the cosmological basis of lexicography and not just with the aspect of meaning. And he put out this this argument at the time that it was made. I don't know if he followed it up because we don't quite have access to all his writings, but that was one important gesture in the direction of grammar.
If there are any questions, please type them in the chat box.
If I may just speak by virtue of having access to my voice. So this Geetha presents a very different, well, maybe a more complex picture, not necessarily very different, where if you look at Subhati Ramaswamy's work on Tamil as mother, and and what you have here is quite a different picture of an individual's relations to the language. So in Ayogi Das, it comes with Buddhism as the core, Tamil as inherently Buddhist. And what you get is a more complex picture than perhaps we have. But clearly, it is also Tamil as mother goddess, is something that saliently emerged in the 20th century and from the late 19th century onwards. So would you consider the self-respecters that you've described as either as part of the same tradition that made Tamil as mother goddess, or are they are in some kind of interrogation with that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, Sumati's work is sort of takes a very synchronic approach to looking at imagery, and
Right.
she collates a number of historical moments which make it difficult for us to understand why those descriptions emerged in the first place. Having said that, there is a history of viewing language in terms of the gendered, the female body. It's there in nationalist discourse
Yes.
in Tamil, for example. It's also there in the writings of the DMK ideologues. So my talk today did not deal with that phase of the Dravidian movement because I think that is what has sort of come to define Dravidian nationalism in some ways, which I alluded to very briefly, that there is this affective aspect and the cerebral aspect. And this affective aspect is constitutively gendered. So, for example, just to give you a flavor of how gendered it can be, and it's not simply the mother figure. So, one of the most oft-repeated wall writings in the 1965 protests was when Tamil is sort of compared to the designated bride, the cross-cousin bride that every Dravidian man can hope to marry. English is seen as the beloved, the mistress that he can hope to have, whereas Hindi is the whore.
Oh.
So it's a very, and these terms circulated in very, very complex ways in the kind of anti-Hindi rhetoric that was resonant from the late 1930s. And one can actually mark a sort of disjuncture in the self-respect magazines between prior to 1937 and after 1937. I think the affective gender dimensions of language and the nationalist ways in which language embodies the putative Dravidian nation, I made very clear. There's this amazing cartoon where Tamil becomes Draupadi, and Rajaji and his cabinet become the Kauravas for stripping Draupadi of her honor. So the self-respecters do an immediate sort of retreat, and later on in the 40s, you see those images disappear from their newspapers, but they acquire a very rich life in DMK journalism. So gender is certainly very central to this project, and at least in my understanding, Dravidian nationalism is a very complex project in which subalternity and masculinity are interwoven in extremely tight ways. And it is only the self-respecters imminent critique of the language that allows you to interrogate that. And more recently, the Dalit and feminist critique of that politics.
So would you say that there is enough, and just to follow up, since nobody's in the chat box, so would you say there is enough material from this period that you just described where, maybe there isn't any direct engagement with grammar, but it is with the form and the substance of language in, what do names signify, which worldviews do they embed you in, etc. That there is enough and widespread literature in the self-respecters movement to merit further study or in-depth study? Is there a lot of things there? I'm just scouting for possible PhD
Oh,
topics.
no, no, certainly. I mean, in fact, I've always sort of urged students who are interested in language to actually look at the keywords of the self-respect writings. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done there. And they themselves fostered language reform in a big way. At one point, they wanted to do what Ataturk was doing, take off the Tamil script and use Roman script to do Tamil. That was one of their most maximalist thing about, getting away from affective sentimentality. But also, they wanted a more simplified form of the Tamil alphabet to encourage the use of the typewriter and looking forward that make it easy for the language to be used through the use of machines, which is the Tamil that you have today in some ways. So they were interested in questions of syntax and the shape of word, letters, and so on. And there's certainly enough within their writings to merit a close look at how might we place them in terms of a history of linguistics.
Exactly.
There's certainly a lot to be done. And that can sort of connect nicely with what Satya has asked me, the Dalit and feminist critique of Dravidian nationalism. I think that's the question. Yeah, and I think this is a very it's a very it's not a very recent critique. It's existed for the last 2 decades in some ways. But I think what's interesting is if I can focus on it through the prism of language, what the emergence of Dalit literature in Tamil did, which happens in the late 80s in a big way, though Dalits have been writing since the late 19th century, you have a sort of efflorescence of that literature like happened elsewhere in India. And you see also the emergence of a distinctive literary vocabulary. For instance, the Dalit speech enters Dalit print. And that's, I think, a very, very important development. And when Dalit speech enters Dalit print, what it does is it also complicates our notion of what is Tamil. Because there's also this idea that there is a way of speaking Tamil that alone qualifies you to be Tamil in a certain sense. And Cheri Tamil, or the Tamil spoken in the Cheris, does not quite make it to that proper Tamilness that all of us are meant to aspire towards. So I think the Dalit presence in print as sort of completely unsettled the certainty of what is Tamil, A, and B, when you have someone like the brilliant Raj Gautaman, our most famous literary historian and critique, who advances an anti-caste Tamil literary historiography, then you have something quite fascinating, because what he does is he unpacks Tamil secularity itself, and he tries to sort of indicate that if we wish to retain Tamil as a badge of secularity, then we must confront the question of caste and untouchability frontally. And we need to reread our literary classics in ways that point to how separation and abjection were built into their content. And if there is sort of a space for emancipatory of emancipatory literature or lexicality, then we need to draw these out and show how these can be made to work. So there is that very strong critical voice emerging from within Tamil letters and within the area of Tamil literature itself. And politically, of course, there has been a consistent questioning of Tamilness, so to speak. What is Tamilness? Uh, can you have a putative Tamil identity when there is still the division of spaces, when there is still untouchability, when there is a sort of everyday tension in village life, when Dalit attempts to assert rights is not countenanced. There is that constant critique made by Dalit parties, even as they keep conversation open with the larger non-Brahmin Dravidian world. The feminist critique is more agonistic, largely because this is not again unfamiliar. No one wants to listen to the feminist critique seriously, because what it means is a very sort of radical relooking of the terms of the Dravidian consensus itself, and to understand where this consensus worked, where it sort of explicitly was patriarchal, where it sort of closed off avenues for further discussion and so on. Some of us have been trying to do it, but it's not been a very easy thing to do in the Tamil context. And also because the only point of congruence for this critique is with the Dalit critique, and the Dalit feminist dyad is sort of induces a great amount of anxiety in circles that still wish to uphold a less problematic view of the Dravidian consensus. A question from YouTube: could I speak more about the difference between political biography in opposition to hagiography? To go further, what was the view when political biography assumed hagiographic modes based on genealogies of power, property, vocation, etc.? Thank you. That's a very good question. I actually want to sort of reference a particular article that C.N. Annadurai wrote in 1947 or 48, I'm not sure, while he was still with Periyar and the Dravidar Kazhagam before the DMK was formed, where he sort of takes to task the kind of routine fare that's found in Tamil journalism. And he speaks of how he actually counts the number of articles, a number of paragraphs devoted to these subjects, and shows how interpretations of scripture, harikathas, modern dance that draws from the Itihasas and Puranas, literature that has to do with religion, these seem to occupy an inordinate amount of space in Tamil journalism. And against these kinds of writings, he urges forth the claims of history writing, and not simply about Dravidian history, but he says, let's draw on world historical accounts, let's learn the history of others like us who are challenging Hindu, Hindi, Hindustan. And he explicitly references Fizo and the Naga nationalists in the Northeast. He speaks of Ireland. So at that point in time, when he was still sort of gesturing again in this very sort of broad manner against Hindu, Hindi, Hindustan, you have him making claims for a history writing which is different and counterposed to Puranic mythological writing. He also says it's important to know of the lives of great men in history, the movements that they commanded, and so on and so forth, and therefore the claims of political biography as against hagiography. Now, of course, what you have is that right from, say, perhaps the 1950s onwards, with the effective power of Dravidian nationalism winning for itself a very wide constituency of adherents, there is also the making of a new gallery of leaders who are then sort of seen as blameless, entirely sort of devoted to the cause of Tamil and Dravidian nationalism, who can then be sort of seen as worthy forebears. Now, that's on the one hand. On the other hand, you have the construction of a canon of Tamil thinkers or Tamil scholars and Tamil writers, which continues within two different realms, one in English and one in Tamil. And what you see in the English, and I'm glad that Aisha brought in Srimati Ramasami's work, is that the kinds of texts that assume centrality in English writings on Tamil intellectual life or on Tamil political history, they make for a certain sort of argument which positions certain writers in a favorable position vis-a-vis other writers. And I'm not talking explicitly of Smriti's book, but generally there's a great deal of writing in English on Tamil political developments which does that. In contrast to that is writing in Tamil which hagiographizes the Dravidian movement itself. So one needs to therefore look for that space where you sort of draw from the rich and contentious debates from within the Tamil world, and do not peg your political accounts or the accounts of intellectual history only to these hagiographies of the present, but neither do you sort of speak to a wider world without your speech bearing the impress of these very complicated vernacular debates. So that's how I would understand that question.
Yeah. So I think there are no questions, and also it's 6:15 now. I think let's close this session. Thank you, Geetha. for this presentation and also for his solidarity, and hope Hani Babu will be released soon. And thank you.
Thank you,
And
Satya. Thank you very much.
thank
I
so
said we'll have
next
a
session.
1 minute break so
Yeah.
that we can stop and restart.
Yes, a 1 minute break.